Primary functions of Congress is to represent the people of the United States. Let's take a brief look at the issue of representation and how Congress performs with regard to this important function. First, let's clarify a few terms. Representation, at its most basic level, is the act of speaking on behalf of someone else. If we break down the roots of the word, we get the idea of making something present again. In this case, the voice of the people in a legislative body, even when the people themselves cannot physically be in attendance. The idea of representation is an ancient one, but there are ongoing debates about how it should actually be carried out. We'll get to that in a second. When we talk about representation, there are two parties that are critical to that act. The first party is the representative, the person who speaks on others' behalf. The second party is the constituent, the person who is being spoken for by the representative. As I just mentioned, there are conflicting ideas about how representation ought to work. The first part of this conflict has to do with what's called substantive representation. This dimension of representation has to do with reflecting the views and interests of constituents. There are differing views about how to achieve substantive representation. The first is what's called the trustee view. It was originally spelled out by Edmund Burke, an 18th century British political philosopher and elected representative in the House of Commons. Burke argued that representatives should do their best to understand the views of their constituents and take those views into consideration, but ultimately it was up to the representative to exercise his best judgment about what was best for his constituents and for the nation as a whole. In this view, the voters choose representatives who are deemed to have good judgment and broadly reflect the principles and political viewpoint of the voters. However, since the voters themselves have only very limited information about the details of public policy, it's up to the representative to make wise decisions, even when a majority of constituents might disagree. The delegate view is the opposite of the trustee view. The delegate view argues that representatives should faithfully uphold their constituents' preferences, even if the representative disagrees. In other words, the job of the representative is to ascertain public opinion as best as possible, and then follow that opinion, regardless of personal view. Generally speaking, members of Congress represent the substantive views of their constituents fairly well. As your textbook mentions, political science studies have found that members of Congress vote according to the preferences of their constituents about 2/3 of the time. Now, you can make a pretty good argument that 2/3 is far too low. But it's also true that the higher profile an issue is to voters, for instance, things like healthcare, abortion, or gun law, the more likely it is that that representative will abide by the opinion of their constituents. It's generally on lower profile issues where representatives feel they have more leeway to chart their own course. Another dimension of representation is descriptive representation. This gets at how much a representative body reflects important, politically relevant demographic characteristics in society, things like race and ethnicity, gender, social class, religion, and age. As we'll see in a moment, Congress in general, and the Senate especially, are a very poor representational match to the broader society. Now, there's some debate about how much emphasis should be placed upon descriptive representation. One school of thought argues that so long as elected officials do a good job of representing the views and interests of their constituents, the demographic descriptors of that representative really don't matter. Think, for instance, of a female voter who considers herself to be pro-life, in other words, would like to see abortion outlawed or greatly restricted. She may face a choice between two candidates in an election, one who is a man who also reflects her views on abortion, the other a woman who's a supporter of abortion rights. Even though the female candidate may represent this voter descriptively, the voter is more likely to choose the male candidate who does a better job of representing her substantively. So that's one view on descriptive representation. Another view holds that descriptive representation is important both symbolically and substantively. Symbolically, it's important to have representative bodies that reflect the diversity of society at large in order for the decisions of legislatures to be viewed as legitimate. The symbolic importance of descriptive representation was illustrated in pretty dramatic fashion during the recent confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. When Christine Blasey Ford was called to testify about the alleged sexual assault she suffered at the hands of Kavanaugh, the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee faced a dilemma. There's never been a female Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and having an all-male panel question the veracity of Dr. Ford's testimony would look quite bad. So they yielded their questioning time to an outside prosecutor just for this hearing, a very unusual step for a congressional committee to take. But beyond symbolism, descriptive representation is also important because it can go hand in hand with substantive representation. The idea here is that demographic characteristics play a role in our life experiences and our understanding of society and public issues. Having a more descriptively diverse legislature is more likely to be a legislature in which representatives have a richer, more personal understanding of the difficulties that different Americans face, and therefore can do a better job of representing their substantive interests in Congress. So, how descriptively representative is Congress? The answer is not very. The House does do quite a bit better than the Senate, though. The House is currently composed of 235 Democrats and 199 Republicans. This is almost a mirror image of the partisan balance of the House prior to the 2018 elections, when the Republicans were in the majority with 240 representatives, while the Democrats held 195 seats. Democrats did very well in the 2018 elections, highlighting a common occurrence in which the president's party tends to lose seats in Congress in midterm elections. 24% of legislators in the House are women. While this is far from parity, it does represent a substantial step in the right direction, as there are several more women serving in the House of Representatives today than at any other point in the country's history. In terms of racial and ethnic diversity, about 13% of the members of the House are African American, 10% are Latino, and 3% are Asian American. This is relatively close to the racial and ethnic demographics for the country as a whole. Part of the story here is the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed gerrymandering, or drawing of district lines, to try to dilute the voting strength of minority groups. This allowed heavily minority towns and regions to send members of their communities to Congress for the first time since Reconstruction. While the House is relatively racially diverse, only 4% of its members were born outside of the United States. Thinking back to Chapter 1, where we learned that 15% of people now residing in the United States are foreign-born, we can see that immigrants are quite heavily underrepresented in Congress. The average age of a member of the House of Representatives is 57. It's not surprising that members of the House would be well into their adulthoods, since this is not an entry-level job. But even so, it's striking how old most members are. While much attention has been placed on 2018 as the Year of the Woman, one of the less reported trends is that many of the candidates for the House last year were considerably younger than average, with many in their 30s and 40s. The current Congress actually represents a step in the right direction towards greater age diversity. Finally, the average member of Congress has served 8 years in office, meaning they've served 4 terms. While a handful of representatives have served for decades, the turnover rate in the House is actually relatively high. The Senate is currently comprised of 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. So while Democrats hold a majority in the House, Republicans hold a majority in the Senate. This circumstance, in which each party controls at least one branch of government, is known as divided government. Prior to the 2018 elections, Republicans held a majority of both chambers of Congress, as well as the White House. That situation, in which one party controls all the elected branches of government, is known as unified government. Back to the Senate. 25 women currently serve in the Senate. Again, like the House, this represents an all-time high in terms of gender diversity. Where the Senate is much less diverse than the House is in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, with only 3 African American, 4 Latino, and 3 Asian American members. The average senator is 62 years old, even older than in the House, and has served 10 years in office. 1/2 of senators previously served in the House, illustrating that the Senate is considered the more prestigious chamber, as politicians use their seats in the House as a stepping stone to the Senate. In terms of religion, Congress is heavily Protestant, with also strong representation of Catholics and Jews. Other religions, and people claiming no religious faith, are relatively underrepresented. In terms of prior backgrounds, nearly 1 in 5 members of Congress have military experience, and 3% are still active in the National Guard or Reserves. Further, about half the people who serve in Congress hold law degrees. Members make a salary of $174,000 per year, a relatively low salary given the prestige of the job, but don't feel too sorry for them, as about 1 out of 3 members become lobbyists after they leave Congress. In those positions, former members of Congress see their salaries increase several times over.